These are the 23 official decorations of one American soldier, a boy who lied about his age to get into the war, who got rejected by the Marines, the Navy, and the paratroopers for being too small, and who ended up becoming the most decorated combat soldier the United States Army produced in the Second World War. This is the story of Audie Murphy. Kingston, Texas, is where it started. Audie Murphy was born there on June 20th, 1925, in the Blackland Prairie cotton country of Hunt County in northeastern Texas, and that date matters more than it should, because it is not the date that appears anywhere on his military records. His official Army paperwork lists his birth year as 1924, a full year older than the truth, and the reason for that gap is simple. Audie and his sister falsified it so he could meet the Army's minimum age requirement. Every document the Army generated about him afterward carried that same false year, and it still sits on his headstone at Arlington National Cemetery today. Biographer David A. Smith, working with the Audie Murphy Research Foundation, traced the real year back to 1925 using Murphy's California driver's license and the recollections of David McClure, the man who later co-wrote Murphy's memoir. His father, Emmett Berry Murphy, went by Pat, and he worked as a sharecropper of English, Irish, Scots-Irish, Scottish, and German descent. His mother, Josie Bell Murphy, was born a Killian. Audie came 7th out of 12 children, and 9 of the 12 made it to adulthood, which tells you something about the conditions they were living in. The family farmed other people's land in shacks with no electricity and no running water, right through the worst years of the Great Depression, and school ended for Audie after the 5th grade, around 1936, when he started picking cotton for about $1 a day. He also worked a general store, a filling station, and a radio repair shop over in Greenville, and hunting became something closer to a job than a hobby, since the small game he shot was often what fed his family. Somewhere around 1939 or 1940, his father walked out and never came back. Then, on May 23, 1941, when Audie was 15 or 16, his mother died, and the 3 youngest children ended up in an orphanage. Audie would get them back out after the war. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941, and Audie Murphy tried to enlist almost immediately. The Marine Corps turned him down. So did the Navy. So did the Army's paratroopers, every branch citing the same reason, that he was underweight and underage. His sister, Corinne Burns, signed a notarized statement falsifying his birth year to get him past that barrier, and Army induction records show him enlisting at Dallas, Texas, on June 30, 1942, with his acceptance for service recorded at Greenville. Some records push that acceptance date back closer to June 20th. Either way, by the end of that June, a 5'5", 112-pound teenager who looked even younger than his falsified age was wearing an Army uniform, and his fellow soldiers would soon start calling him Little Texas. Camp Walters in Texas is where his training began, and by September of 1942 he had earned a marksman badge with a rifle clasp and an expert badge with a bayonet clasp. From there he moved on to advanced infantry training at Fort George G. Meade in Maryland, where he passed out during a hot weather drill, and his company commander tried to reassign him to cook and baker school afterward. Murphy refused that outright. Combat infantry was what he wanted, and combat infantry was what he got. North Africa came first. Murphy shipped out in February of 1943, landing at Casablanca, and he was assigned to Company B, 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, a unit nicknamed the Rock of the Man. On July 10, 1943, his regiment landed at Licata, Sicily, as part of Operation Husky, and that landing marked his first taste of actual combat. September of that year brought the Salerno landings on the Italian mainland and brutal fighting through the Volturno line, and by October 1st the Allies had taken Naples. January of 1944 put his division on the beaches at Anzio for Operation Shingle, one of the grinding, static battles that defined the Italian campaign, and on March 2nd of that year, still at Anzio, Murphy destroyed a disabled enemy tank using rifle grenades, an action that earned him his first Bronze Star. May 8, 1944, brought the Combat Infantryman Badge, awarded to Murphy along with 61 other members of Company B, and an oak leaf cluster to his Bronze Star followed around the same time. Later that month, from the 22nd to the 25th of May, his company was torn apart in the Second Battle of Cisterna. Rome fell on June 4th and 5th. None of that reads like the opening of a legend. It reads like survival, plain and simple. What happened over the following 8 months is what changed a poor, undersized Texas teenager into the most decorated soldier in the United States Army, and it also nearly killed him 3 separate times. Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France, put Murphy's division on a stretch of coast near Ramatuelle called Yellow Beach on August 15, 1944, and it was here that Murphy's closest friend in the Army, Private Latai Tipton of Tennessee, was killed. Tipton had been something like an older brother to Murphy for most of the war, and what Murphy did in response to his death earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award for valor. Murphy put it bluntly years later: he won the Distinguished Service Cross, and all Tipton got was death. That Distinguished Service Cross is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the award that separates Murphy from another soldier sometimes described as his rival for the title of Most Decorated. Lieutenant Colonel Matt Urban did not receive his Medal of Honor until 1980, decades after the war, and modern comparisons occasionally place him alongside or even above Murphy. But the Military Times Hall of Valor database puts the two records side by side and still gives Murphy the edge, specifically because he holds the Distinguished Service Cross, an award Urban never received. The more precise title here, then, isn't simply Most Decorated Soldier of the War without any qualification. It's Most Decorated American Combat Soldier of World War II, a distinction historians still occasionally argue over, but one the documentary record ultimately favors Murphy on. From August 27th to 29th, Murphy's battalion fought at Montelimar, earning the 1st Battalion a Presidential Unit citation, and on October 2nd, near a spot called Cleary Quarry, Murphy picked up his first Silver Star. 3 days later, near Latholi, came his second. That same month brought a battlefield commission, lifting him from enlisted man to second lieutenant, an enormous jump for someone who had walked in as a private 2 years earlier. Then came Holtzwi, and this is the moment that would define the rest of his life whether he wanted it to or not. January 26, 1945, near the French town of Holtzwi in the Colmar Pocket, is where 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy made his stand. His company had been ground down by casualties to roughly a fifth of its authorized strength, and the Germans came at them with 6 tanks and waves of infantry, an attacking force some estimates place at around 250 soldiers. Murphy ordered his men back to prepared positions in the woods and stayed forward alone, directing artillery fire by field telephone from the top of a burning M10 tank destroyer that could have exploded under him at any second. The official Medal of Honor citation lays out what happened next without much room for interpretation. For an hour, the Germans threw every weapon they had at him, and still he held his position, wiping out a squad that tried creeping up on his right flank. Some of them got within 10 yards of him. All of them went down under his fire. A leg wound didn't stop him either. He kept fighting until his ammunition ran out, and the artillery he directed tore into the attacking force so badly that the citation credits him with killing or wounding about 50 enemy soldiers in that single engagement. His refusal to give ground, the citation states, is what saved his company from being encircled and wiped out. Here's where the numbers get complicated, and it's worth slowing down for this, because the most repeated statistic about Audie Murphy is also the least documented one. You'll often hear that he personally killed 240, or in some versions 241, German soldiers over the course of the war. That figure traces back to Army crediting practices from the era and to the framing of Murphy's own 1949 memoir. Biographer David A. Smith writes that according to Army records, over the 20 months Murphy served in the European combat theatre, he was responsible for eliminating at least 240 enemy soldiers. But no primary Army document itemizing an actual body count has ever surfaced, and Murphy himself denied in later interviews that any such precise tally existed. He said he never kept count and didn't want to know. The more careful framing, the one used by outlets like Warfare History Network, is that Murphy was credited with killing, wounding, or capturing around 240 enemy soldiers combined, not 240 confirmed kills outright. Treat that number as a wartime estimate that hardened into legend over 80 years, not as an itemized ledger. The Holtzwi number sits on much firmer ground, since 50 killed or wounded in that single action comes straight from the signed Medal of Honor citation, the single most scrutinized document in his entire record. The National World War II Museum, through historian Tyler Bamford, gives a more conservative figure, stating that Murphy killed over 20 German soldiers in that engagement alone, on top of helping stop and destroy 6 tanks. Brigadier General Ralph B. Lovett and Lieutenant Colonel Howlett D. Edson recommended Murphy for the Medal of Honor, and on June 2, 1945, near Salzburg, Austria, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch presented it to him in person, along with the Legion of Merit. By the time the war ended, Murphy had logged roughly 400 days on the front lines, according to the Association of the United States Army's official biography, and he had fought through 9 separate campaigns: Tunisia, Sicily, Naples Forja, Anzio, Romano, southern France, the Ardennes, the Rhineland, and Central Europe. 3 wounds earned him a Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, dated September 15th and October 26th of 1944, and January 25th of 1945, the day before his Medal of Honor action. Malaria and gangrene hit him more than once during that stretch as well. The official decorations list, maintained by the Audie Murphy Research Foundation and drawn from his Army personnel file, runs to 23 distinct entries in order of precedence. That list includes the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with 1 oak leaf cluster covering 2 separate awards, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star Medal with a Valor device and 1 oak leaf cluster covering 2 more separate awards, the Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters covering 3 awards, the Good Conduct Medal, the Distinguished Unit Emblem with an oak leaf cluster, the American Campaign Medal, the European African Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 1 silver and 3 bronze battle stars representing all 9 campaigns plus a bronze arrowhead for the assault landings at both Sicily and southern France, the World War II Victory Medal, the Army of Occupation Medal with a Germany clasp, the Armed Forces Reserve Medal, the Combat Infantryman Badge, a Marksmanship Badge with a rifle bar, and an Expert Badge with a bayonet bar. France added the Furigi, the Legion of Honor at the rank of Chevalier, and the Croix de Guerre with Palm and Silver Star, awarded twice, plus the Medal of Liberated France. Belgium contributed its own Croix de Guerre with Palm. You'll see Murphy's total decoration count reported differently depending on where you look, sometimes 21, sometimes 23, sometimes 28, sometimes 33, and none of those numbers are wrong exactly, they're just counting differently. The U.S. Army's own Fort Lee Garrison history, along with Biography.com and biographer Harold B. Simpson, cite 33 awards, citations, and decorations by counting every repeat, every device, and every badge as its own entry rather than folding them into a base medal. 23 groups those repeats together. 21 reflects an earlier count taken closer to his 1945 discharge, before later additions like a 1961 Outstanding Civilian Service Medal and a posthumous Texas Legislative Medal of Honor from 2013. Whichever number you land on, the underlying fact stays the same. Audie Murphy received every major combat valor award the Army offered during his era of service, and as the Fort Lee Garrison history puts it, the Army has always declared there will never be another Audie Murphy. Discharge came on September 21, 1945, but by then his face was already famous. On July 16th of that year, Life magazine had put him on its cover as America's most decorated soldier, and that cover is what caught the attention of actor James Cagney, who, along with his brother William Cagney, invited Murphy out to Hollywood. Stardom didn't come easily to him, and he actually pushed back against it at first, suggesting at one point that Tony Curtis take the lead role when his own memoir eventually got adapted for film. That memoir, titled To Hell and Back and co-written with David Speck McClure, came out in 1949 through Henry Holt and Company, and that same year Murphy landed his first starring role in a film called Bad Boy for Allied Artists. Also in 1949, on February 8th, Murphy married actress Wanda Hendricks, and the marriage fell apart fast. Hendricks later described being held at gunpoint by Murphy during flashback episodes tied to his wartime experience, along with gambling losses that drained her savings and jealousy she found suffocating. 13 months later, they divorced on grounds of mental cruelty, and 4 days after that divorce was finalized in 1951, Murphy married Pamela Opal Lee Archer. That marriage held for the rest of his life and produced 2 sons, Terry Michael in 1952 and James Shannon, nicknamed Skipper, in 1954. Universal International locked Murphy into a 7-year studio contract in 1950, reportedly paying him $2,500 a week, and that same year, hoping for a shot at serving in Korea, he joined the 36th Infantry Division of the Texas National Guard. 1951 brought a loan out to MGM for John Huston's adaptation of The Red Badge of Courage, reportedly at a salary of $25,000, and Huston later described casting him this way: "This little, gentle-eyed creature," he said, "who in the war would literally go out of his way to find Germans to kill, a gentle little killer." The film version of his own story premiered on August 17, 1955, at the Majestic Theatre in San Antonio, with Murphy playing himself, and To Hell and Back became a genuine commercial hit. Across a film career that ran roughly from 1948 to 1969, he appeared in more than 40 feature films, commonly cited as 44, most of them westerns, and in 1961 he starred in a television series called Whispering Smith. That same year, on November 7th, he received the Army Outstanding Civilian Service Medal, tied to a film called The Broken Bridge. Here's a detail that complicates the tidy Hollywood version of this story. The 1955 film shows Murphy's Medal of Honor stand at Holtzwi in mild weather, with clear visibility, on rolling terrain, with Murphy perched on an M4 Sherman tank. None of that matches what actually happened. The real fight took place in brutal winter conditions with poor visibility on flat Alsatian ground, and Murphy wasn't anywhere near a Sherman tank. He was on an M10 tank destroyer, a completely different vehicle. Screenwriter Gil Dowd also toned down the book's more graphic violence to satisfy the era's motion picture production code, and several of Murphy's actual comrades got folded into composite characters for the screen, including Latai Tipton, the friend who died beside him in southern France, who became a character named Brandon. Hollywood sold audiences a cleaner, warmer version of a battle that was, in reality, fought alone in freezing mud on top of a dying vehicle. Away from film sets, Murphy quietly built a second career as a country songwriter, writing for other performers rather than singing himself, working mostly with a collaborator named Scott Turner, along with contributions from Guy Mitchell, Jimmy Bryant, Coy Ziegler, and Terry Edelman. Murphy wrote songs eventually recorded by Dean Martin, Eddie Arnold, Charlie Pride, Porter Wagoner, Roy Clark, and Harry Nilsson. His 2 biggest hits, both from 1962 and both co-written with Turner, were Shutters and Boards and When the Wind Blows in Chicago, and according to Turner, Shutters and Boards alone had been recorded by roughly 60 different vocalists in multiple languages by the early 1970s. Poetry came out of him too, discovered by McClure among discarded papers in Murphy's apartment. One piece, The Crosses Grow on Anzio, got folded into the memoir itself under a fictional character's name, while others, including Alone and Far Removed and Freedom Flies in Your Heart Like an Eagle, later set to music as Dusty Old Helmet, stood on their own. And mindful of his influence on younger audiences, Murphy made a point of turning down every alcohol and cigarette advertisement offered to him, an unusual stance for a star of that era. None of that success touched what was happening underneath. What the era called battle fatigue, and what would now get diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, followed Murphy home from the war and never really left. Insomnia, recurring nightmares, depression, and what people close to him described as survivor's guilt became part of his daily life, and he slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. At one point he converted his own garage into a bedroom, apparently connected to his psychological state, and by the mid-1960s he had developed a dependency on a prescription sleeping medication called Placidil, which he eventually broke by locking himself alone in a motel room through a week of withdrawal. What sets Murphy apart from most decorated combat veterans of his generation isn't that he struggled this way. Plenty of veterans did, silently, for the rest of their lives. It's that he talked about it publicly, at a time when almost nobody did. He spoke about his own trauma specifically to draw attention to the returning veterans of Korea, and later Vietnam, and he pushed for the government to study combat's emotional toll and expand health benefits to address it. In a 1967 interview with journalist Thomas Morgan, Murphy laid it out about as plainly as anyone could. Becoming an executioner, someone cold and analytical, trained to kill, and then coming back into civilian life to stand alone in a crowd, that takes an awfully long time to get over, he said. Fear and depression come over you. That public honesty is a large part of why Murphy is remembered today as more than a war hero. He's remembered as an early, unusually visible voice for what we now call veterans' mental health, a legacy that connects directly to modern VA mental health services and to today's veteran support organizations, decades before that conversation became normal in American life. The private cost of carrying all this stayed severe right up until the end. Murphy's temper ran quick and occasionally violent, and in 1968 he stated publicly that he'd lost $260,000 in a failed Algerian oil investment while fighting the Internal Revenue Service over unpaid taxes, a combination that pushed him into bankruptcy that same year. Then in May of 1970, Burbank police arrested him on a charge of battery and assault with intent to commit murder, stemming from a dispute with a dog trainer. He denied firing the shot in question and was later acquitted. May 28, 1971, is when it ended, in a plane crash on Brush Mountain, Virginia. Arlington National Cemetery is where they buried him, on June 7th of that year, in Section 46, and at his own request his headstone stayed plain, without the gold leaf finish standard for Medal of Honor recipients, because he wanted it to look like the headstone of an ordinary soldier. Today, his grave draws more visitors than any other at Arlington except President John F. Kennedy's, and the cemetery added a special walkway of flagstones just to handle the crowds. Recognition kept building after he was gone. About 5 months after his death, Representative Olin Teague introduced legislation that led, in 1973, to the dedication of the Audie Murphy Memorial Veterans Hospital in San Antonio, now part of the South Texas Veterans Healthcare System. Fort Hood saw the establishment of the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club in 1986, founded by Lieutenant General Crosby Saint and Command Sergeant Major George L. Horvath, and it has since grown into an Army-wide honor reserved for exceptional non-commissioned officers. Memorials now stand at his crash site on Brush Mountain, placed by the VFW in 1974 along the Appalachian Trail, at Holtzwihr in France where his Medal of Honor action took place, at the Audie Murphy American Cotton Museum in Greenville with a 10-foot bronze statue dedicated in 2002, at Camp Mabry with a statue from 1985, and at the Texas State Cemetery with an obelisk from 1999. He also has a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Texas designated June 20th as Audie Murphy Day in 1996 and reaffirmed it in 1999, and in 2013, the Texas Legislative Medal of Honor, approved under Governor Rick Perry, was presented posthumously to Murphy's sister, Nadine Lockie Murphy, in the town of Farmersville. That recognition hasn't slowed down. In January of 2025, a French documentary called Audie Murphy, From Colmar to Hollywood, made by Patrick Baumann and filmmaker Christian Munzinger, premiered in France to mark the 80th anniversary of the war's end, drawing sold-out crowds in Colmar and Strasbourg, the very region where Murphy fought his Medal of Honor action. Its Texas premiere followed on June 20th of that year, at the Audie Murphy Day celebration in Farmersville, marking both the 80th anniversary of his wartime homecoming and what would have been his 100th birthday. Every fact in this story, the 23 decorations, the 400 days on the front lines, the 50 enemy soldiers cut down in an hour at Holtzwi, the estimate of 240 over the whole war that Murphy himself refused to confirm, traces back to one 5'5", 112-pound teenager who got rejected by 3 branches of the American military for being too small and too young, and who lied about his age to get into the 4th. He became the most decorated American combat soldier of the Second World War not because the army went looking for him, but because he refused to be turned away. And in the quieter, less decorated second half of his life, the failed marriage, the successful songwriting career, the addiction he broke alone in a motel room, the public admission that fear and depression could still overtake a man who once held off 6 tanks by himself, Audie Murphy became something else entirely. He became one of the first widely heard American voices to say, plainly, that surviving the war was never the same thing as coming home from it.